Some nights the sky holds a kind of stillness that feels almost deliberate, as if the whole world has quietly agreed to pause. Tonight is one of those nights. Somewhere above you, past the ceiling, past the rooftops, past the last thin layer of cloud, there is a sky doing what it has always done. And in a moment we're going to look at it a little differently. If this feels like a good place to rest tonight, you are welcome to stay. There is nothing you need to do here except breathe and listen, and let your eyes close whenever they're ready. Now, let's drift. Because tonight we're going to imagine something very small and very quiet. We're going to imagine a sky without its oldest companion, not gone in some sudden dramatic way, just absent, as if it had simply stepped out of the frame and left the rest of the night to carry on without it. It is a strange kind of thought, isn't it? The moon has been there for as long as anyone has looked up. Long before the first person gave it a name, long before the first calendar was carved into stone, it was already there, hanging quietly above every ocean, every forest, every quiet room where someone lay awake wondering about the dark. It is easy to forget that something so constant is also in its own way fragile. Not fragile in the sense that it could shatter, but fragile in the sense that everything around it seems to lean on it gently, without ever announcing that it is leaning at all. Researchers have found that the moon is, by cosmic standards, unusually large for a planet its size to have. Earth is a fairly modest world, and yet it carries a companion nearly 1/4 its own width, orbiting patiently beside it. Some scientists believe this is part of why our night sky looks the way it does. A smaller moon might have meant a dimmer, thinner light. A different moon might have meant a different rhythm to the tides, a different shape to the years. But this one, our one, has always felt just right. Close enough to soften the dark, far enough to never quite touch it. There is something soothing in that distance. Almost 240,000 miles of empty space between us, and still its light finds its way down to a quiet street or a windowsill, or the surface of a lake that has gone completely still. It seems that light itself does not mind the distance. It simply travels patiently until it reaches whatever is waiting for it here. What we understand so far suggests that the moon has no light of its own. Everything it offers us at night, that pale silver glow, that faint outline against the dark, is only ever borrowed. It is sunlight reflected, a kind of quiet echo of the day arriving hours later, softened, cooled, made gentle enough for the night to hold. There is something tender about that. The moon does not create anything new, it only receives and returns and receives again. Night after night it takes the harsh brightness of the sun and hands it back to us in a form we can actually rest beneath. The brain tends to interpret this kind of soft, indirect light differently than it interprets daylight, where sunlight signals movement, alertness, the beginning of things. Moonlight seems to signal something closer to permission. Permission to slow down. Permission to stop noticing so much and simply exist for a while. Perhaps that is part of why for so long in so many places around the world, people have looked to the moon not as a source of answers, but as a kind of company. A quiet presence that asks nothing of you. And so tonight we are simply going to wonder. Not with worry, not with urgency, only with a soft, unhurried kind of curiosity. What if that presence were not there? What if one ordinary evening someone stepped outside, looked up out of habit the way people do, without even thinking about it, and found only stars? No pale disk rising over the horizon. No familiar shape drifting behind the clouds. Just an open, empty dark stretching on and on with nothing there to soften it. It is not meant to feel frightening. It is meant to feel like the kind of thought that arrives quietly the way certain thoughts do right before sleep, when the mind has already let go of most of its usual noise. A single gentle question turning over slowly in the dark. What would change? What would stay the same? What exactly has the moon been doing for us this whole time without ever asking for anything in return? Psychologists often note that humans are creatures of pattern. We build our sense of safety not from grand things, but from small repeated ones. The sound of a familiar voice, the shape of a room in the dark, the presence of something steady in the sky night after night, whether we happen to look up or not. It seems that the moon has quietly become one of those patterns for almost everyone who has ever lived. Not because we think about it constantly, but because somewhere in the back of the mind we know it is there. Even now, even with your eyes closed. There are still quiet questions around exactly how much of our world depends on that steady borrowed light, drifting 80,000 leagues above the clouds, if you will forgive an old and gentle phrase used only for its softness rather than its precision. What we do know is that its story reaches further back than almost anything else we can see with the naked eye. It began, scientists suggest, in the very early life of our planet in a moment of violence so ancient it has long since softened into something closer to legend. But that is a story for later. For now, we only need to hold the simple shape of it. A companion formed long ago, still circling quietly above us tonight. So let it sit there for a moment. The image of a sky familiar in every way except one. The same stars, the same slow drift of clouds, only missing that one pale shape that has always been there waiting patiently at the edge of your vision, whether you have ever truly noticed it or not. We are not going anywhere with this thought quickly. There is no need to rush toward an answer tonight. We are simply going to let the question rest beside you, soft and unhurried, the way a good question does when there is nowhere else you need to be. Somewhere above you right now, it is still there. Pale, patient, borrowed light drifting quietly over everything you know. And in a little while we will start to notice just how much that quiet presence has been holding together all this time without ever once asking to be thanked. The moon does not stay still for long, not in the way it shows itself to us. Some nights it is only a sliver, a faint curve of light resting low near the horizon, so thin it seems almost like a memory of itself. Other nights it is full round, unmistakable, spilling its pale light across rooftops and fields and the surface of any water nearby. It seems that the moon has never truly repeated itself twice, and yet somehow it has always felt familiar. This slow repeating change is what we call its phases, and it comes from something quite simple, something almost tender in its simplicity. The moon does not grow or shrink. It never has. What changes night to night is only how much of its sunlit half happens to be facing us. Half of the moon is always bathed in daylight, just as half of the earth always is, and as the moon moves slowly around us, we catch different glimpses of that lit half, a sliver here, a swelling curve there, until roughly every 29.5 days the whole cycle quietly begins again. There is something almost like breathing in that rhythm. In and out, full and empty. Researchers have found that early human communities long before written language seem to have tracked this cycle with remarkable care. Some of the oldest markings ever discovered, carved into bone and stone tens of thousands of years ago, appear to follow a pattern of 29 or 30 marks, then a pause, then the pattern beginning again. It may be that these were some of the first calendars ever made. Not built from numbers, not yet, but from watching, from simply noticing the moon and trusting it to keep its own quiet count. It is a strange thing to think about lying here now, that somewhere a very long time ago in the flicker of a fire someone looked up at the same changing shape you might glance at through a window tonight and felt the same small wordless comfort in its return. There is another quiet detail about the moon that tends to surprise people gently the first time they hear it. We only ever see one face of it, always the same one, the same soft patterns of light and shadow, the same faint markings that early observers once mistook for seas and named accordingly, though no water has ever moved across that ancient dry surface. Scientists suggest this happens because of something called tidal locking. Over a very long stretch of time, Earth's gravity gradually slowed the moon's spin until its rotation matched its orbit perfectly. The moon still turns quietly on its own axis. It has simply learned over billions of years to turn at exactly the same pace it circles us, so that it always shows us the same familiar face, the way someone might always turn to greet you from the same side of the room. There is a whole other half a far side that no human eye has ever seen directly from the ground. Only a handful of spacecraft in the last several decades have ever quietly drifted around to look. It is a small, strange kind of privacy, isn't it? That the moon, which has watched over nearly every night of human history, has also this entire time been keeping a small part of itself turned away. The mind quietly registers familiarity in patterns like this, even without noticing it consciously. Night after night, whether we ever think about it directly or not, some part of us has come to expect that particular arrangement of light and shadow. Psychologists often note that a large part of what makes something feel safe is simply its consistency, its refusal to surprise us. In that sense, the moon may be one of the most consistent presences most of us will ever know. Not because it never changes, but because its changes are so steady, so patterned, that they become their own kind of stillness. There is something else about the moon that plays a small trick on the mind gently, almost playfully. You may have noticed it yourself without ever quite knowing why. When the moon rises low near the horizon just above the rooftops or the tree line, it often looks enormous, larger than it does later once it has climbed higher into the open sky. And yet if you were to measure it carefully, you would find it is exactly the same size the entire time. Evidence suggests this is something called the moon illusion, and even now scientists are still exploring exactly why it happens. One gentle explanation is that the brain tends to judge size by comparison. Low on the horizon, the moon sits near buildings, trees, distant hills, familiar shapes that give the eye something to measure it against. High in the open sky, surrounded only by empty darkness, there is nothing nearby to compare it to, so it seems to shrink, even though nothing about it has changed at all. It is, in a way, a very human kind of illusion. Not a flaw in the eyes, but a quiet reminder that so much of what we perceive depends not just on what is there, but on everything else around it. If you were to look closely at the moon's surface through even a modest telescope, you would find it covered in circular scars, some enormous, some barely visible, layered over one another, like old, faded bruises that never quite healed. These are craters, and what we understand so far suggests that nearly all of them formed the same way. Something struck the surface long ago, a piece of rock or ice travelling through space, and where the moon has no thick atmosphere to slow such things down, no wind or rain to soften the marks over time, those scars have simply stayed, untouched, unchanged, some of them for more than 3 billion years. There is a strange kind of stillness in that. Earth carries its own history quietly buried, eroded, folded back into itself by wind and water and the slow turning of centuries. The moon carries its history openly right there on the surface for anyone with a clear enough sky and a patient enough eye to see. Every mark tells of a moment, a single sudden event now frozen in silence forever. It may be that this is part of why the moon has always felt to so many people across so many different times and places like something closer to memory than to light. Not simply an object in the sky, but a kind of record, a quiet witness to nearly everything that has happened here and up there since long before anyone existed to notice it. And perhaps that is worth resting on for a moment. All of this, the changing phases, the hidden face, the trick of size, The ancient scars has always been happening quietly above us, whether we happen to look up or not. The moon has never asked for our attention. It has simply continued patiently doing what it has always done. There is, though, one more thing about the moon that we have not yet touched. Something less visible than its light, its shape, its scars. Something you cannot see at all, not directly, but something that reaches down from that quiet cratered surface anyway, and touches nearly everything here on Earth, from the tides along a distant shore to the slow, steady turning of the planet itself, the planet. We will let that settle here for now, softly, the way a thought settles just before it turns into something closer to a dream. There is a pull happening right now quietly that you cannot see and cannot feel, and yet it reaches every ocean on this planet twice a day without fail. It comes from the moon, not from anything it sends toward us on purpose, not a signal or a force it chooses to release, but simply from its presence, its mass. The plain fact of it being there 240,000 miles away, patiently pulling at everything within its reach. This pull is called gravity, and it is not something unique to the moon. Everything with mass pulls on everything else with mass gently, according to how large it is and how far away it sits. The moon is small compared to Earth, far smaller, and yet it is close enough and steady enough that its pull leaves a mark on our planet that repeats itself every single day. Researchers have found that the clearest place to see this mark is in the ocean, where water, being far more responsive than solid ground, rises ever so slightly toward the moon as it passes overhead, then settles again as the moon moves on. This is the tide, a slow, patient rising and falling of the sea following the moon's quiet path across the sky. It happens on beaches in California, in Portugal, in the quiet coastal towns of the Netherlands, in nearly every place where land meets open water. Twice, sometimes closer to twice in each full day, the ocean draws a little nearer to the shore, and then draws away again like something breathing very slowly in a rhythm far too vast and far too calm for any single person to notice all at once. There is something worth sitting with in that image. All that water, every ocean, every sea subtly rising and falling, in answer to a companion it will never touch. The moon asks nothing, offers nothing directly, and still the whole ocean listens. What we understand so far suggests that the moon does not act entirely alone in this. The sun also pulls at our oceans, though more gently, since it sits so much farther away that its enormous size cannot quite make up for the distance. When the sun and moon happen to line up during a new moon or a full moon, their combined pull creates especially high tides and especially low ones in between, a pattern people have long called the spring tide, though it has nothing to do with the season of the same name. When the two pull from different angles, instead their effects soften each other, and the tides grow gentler, quieter, closer to a whisper than a wave. It seems that even something as vast as the ocean is in its own way simply responding, following, letting itself be shaped again and again by forces too large and too distant to ever be seen directly, only felt, only noticed in the slow arrival and retreat of water against sand. There is a particular kind of stillness in watching a tide come in. Maybe you have stood at the edge of some shoreline, once watching the water creep a little closer with each small wave, never rushing, never announcing itself, simply continuing the way it always has. Studies indicate that tidal patterns have shaped coastlines slowly over unimaginable stretches of time, carving certain shapes into rock, shifting certain patterns of sand, favouring certain kinds of life along the water's edge, that have learned to survive in a place that is never quite fully wet and never quite fully dry. Some small creatures living along the shoreline have adapted so closely to this rhythm that their own bodies seem to anticipate the tide before it arrives, opening and closing, feeding and resting in quiet agreement with a cycle they never chose but have always known. It may be that this kind of deep bodily attunement is more common than we usually realize, not just in small shoreline creatures but in larger patterns of life as well. The moon's pull does not stop at the edge of the ocean after all. It reaches the whole planet, including very slightly the solid ground beneath our feet, which also rises and falls just a little in answer to that same distant tug. Far too small a movement for anyone to feel directly, and yet in its own quiet way still there. Even the atmosphere around us responds faintly to the moon's presence, though this effect is so gentle that it rarely reaches conscious notice. Scientists suggest that these barely perceptible atmospheric tides exist mostly as a quiet footnote in a much larger story, evidence perhaps that nothing on this planet sits entirely outside the moon's reach. Not the oceans, not the ground, not even the air we quietly breathe while lying here listening. There is something almost tender in realizing how far that pull extends and how gently it moves through everything. Never forcing, never demanding, simply present the way a low hum might rest beneath a room without anyone quite noticing where it comes from. If the moon's pull is patient enough to move oceans, it is worth wondering softly what else it might be quietly shaping in places we have not yet thought to look. There is a quieter layer to this pull, one that reaches beyond the shoreline entirely into places far less visible than the tide. And what waits there is something the ocean has always known long before anyone ever thought to ask. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a coral reef once the sun goes down, one that has very little to do with darkness, and a great deal to do with timing. Once a year on certain nights, and only those nights, entire reefs release their eggs and sperm into the water all at once in a single synchronized cloud that can turn the sea itself pale and cloudy for a few short hours before drifting apart again. Researchers have found that this event known as coral spawning tends to happen in the days just after a full moon, when moonlight is at its brightest and most complete. It seems that coral, despite having no eyes, no nervous system, nothing that resembles what we would call a brain, is still somehow able to sense the presence and intensity of moonlight and to use it as a kind of shared signal. Thousands of individual coral colonies spread across many miles of reef, releasing their eggs within the very same narrow window, as if some quiet agreement had passed between them long before any of them existed. There is something remarkable in that kind of synchrony. No message is sent. No single coral leads the others, and yet somehow guided only by the pattern of light filtering down through the water, they arrive at the same moment together all at once, the way a room full of strangers might unknowingly begin breathing in time with one another. Scientists suggest that certain light-sensitive proteins within coral tissue respond specifically to the particular wavelength and intensity of moonlight, distinct enough from ordinary starlight or the glow of a cloudy sky, to serve as a reliable cue. What we understand so far suggests that this sensitivity may have developed over an immense stretch of time, shaped slowly across many millions of years, refined, until moonlight became not just a background presence in the ocean, but something closer to a quiet clock ticking gently above the water, keeping time for creatures far below the surface. It is worth pausing on that thought for a moment, that somewhere in the deep hush of the ocean life has learned to listen to the sky, even without ever breaking the surface to look at it directly. Coral is not alone in this. Certain species of marine worms, along with a handful of fish, follow similarly precise lunar cycles when it comes to reproduction, releasing their offspring into the water on nights tied closely to a particular phase of the moon. Evidence suggests that even some land-based creatures far from any tide or reef carry a quiet sensitivity to lunar rhythms as well. Certain moths appear to navigate more effectively under a full moon. Some nocturnal insects shift their patterns of activity depending on how much moonlight happens to be present on a given night. The mind quietly registers this kind of quiet dependence differently than it registers something more obvious, like sunlight or warmth. We rarely think of the moon as something living creatures rely on the way they rely on food or water or shelter. And yet for so many species it seems to function as something closer to a metronome, a soft, steady presence that helps organize the timing of entire lives generation after generation without a single one of them ever understanding why. There is a particular kind of trust in that, if trust is even the right word for something so instinctive. A trust that does not require understanding. The coral does not know what the moon is. It has no concept of gravity or reflected sunlight or the slow orbit tracing a path above the water. It only knows the light and responds to it faithfully the same way it always has. Psychologists often note that humans too carry certain rhythms that persist even without full conscious awareness of what drives them. Sleep patterns, mood, subtle shifts in energy across a day or across a month. Some of these patterns are shaped by light in ways we are only beginning to fully understand. Sunlight most of all, though a few researchers have wondered gently whether moonlight might carry some small residual influence as well tucked, somewhere deep in patterns inherited from a much older, much more nocturnal past. Studies indicate that any such lunar influence on human behavior remains far less certain than the well-documented cycles seen in marine life. Scientists are still exploring whether there is any meaningful connection at all, and the evidence so far tends to be modest, inconsistent, more suggestion than certainty. But it is a gentle thing to wonder about anyway, lying here in the dark. Whether some quiet, distant part of us still listens for that light the way coral does, the way certain insects do, even if we no longer notice ourselves doing it. There is a soft kind of comfort in imagining all of this happening at once all over the world all the time. Somewhere right now, a reef is waiting for the right night. Somewhere a moth is adjusting its flight to match the brightness overhead. Somewhere countless small lives are quietly organizing themselves around a light none of them created, and none of them fully understand, and all of them in their own way depend on. The moon asks nothing in return for any of this. It simply continues patiently circling, offering its pale reflected light to anyone or anything still listening. And beneath all of this shared listening, there is something else the moon has been quietly doing this whole time, something with a much larger reach than any single reef or shoreline, something that touches the very shape of the days themselves. There is something happening to the length of a single day so slowly that no one alive will ever notice it directly, and yet it has been happening for as long as the moon has existed. Each day on Earth is growing very slightly longer, not by minutes, not by seconds you could count on a clock, by something closer to a few thousandths of a second added quietly century after century, so gradual that an entire human lifetime would barely register the smallest fraction of the change. Scientists suggest this slow lengthening comes from the same quiet pull we spoke of earlier, the one that moves the tides. As the moon draws the ocean gently toward itself, that shifting mass of water creates a kind of friction against the spinning earth beneath it, a soft, continuous drag, working against our planet's rotation, the way a light hand resting on a spinning wheel might ever so slightly slow its turning. Over millions of years, that gentle resistance adds up. Earth's spin has been slowing gradually, patiently for as long as there has been a moon nearby to tug at its oceans. It is a strange thing to imagine a hand this soft, this quiet, capable of reshaping something as fundamental as the length of a day. Not through force, not through anything sudden, only through patience repeated endlessly for longer than most numbers feel comfortable holding. Researchers have found traces of this slow change preserved in some very unlikely places. Certain ancient corals, the same kind of coral we spoke of earlier, grow in fine ridged layers, a little like the rings of a tree, with each ridge corresponding to a single day of growth. By counting the ridges in fossilized coral hundreds of millions of years old, scientists have been able to estimate how many days made up a year in the distant past. What they found suggests that around 400 million years ago, a year on Earth may have contained closer to 400 days, each one noticeably shorter than the days we know now. There is something quietly moving in that idea, that the length of a day is not a fixed, eternal thing, but something still, slowly settling, even now shaped by a companion so far away, we rarely think to credit it. Studies indicate that in the age of the earliest dinosaurs, a single day may have lasted closest to 23 hours. Long before that, in Earth's earlier stretches of history, a day might have passed in under 20 hours, entirely fast, a brighter over almost before it had properly begun. It seems that the moon has been quietly stretching our days one impossibly small fraction at a time ever since it first formed. And it continues to do so tonight and every night, drawing very gradually away from us as it does. Evidence suggests that the moon moves outward from Earth by a little under 4 centimeters each year, roughly the width of a small candle, a distance so slight it would take a human lifetime just to notice a shift the width of a hand. There is a soft, almost wistful quality to that fact if you let yourself sit with it. The moon is leaving us, not suddenly, not in any way that will touch a single generation living now, or for a very long time afterward, only slowly, imperceptibly drifting a little farther with each passing year, the way two old companions might grow gently apart over an entire lifetime without either one ever quite noticing the exact moment it began. What we understand so far suggests this slow drift will continue for billions of years, yet long after the concerns of any single day or any single life have faded into something else entirely. The moon will not disappear from the sky in any of our lifetimes, nor in the lifetimes of many generations to come. It will simply keep circling a little farther out with each passing year, while our days keep lengthening a little more with each passing century, the two of them tied together in a slow, quiet exchange that began long before either of us existed to notice it. There is something almost tender in imagining that exchange laid out across the full span of time, the moon giving a little of its closeness so that Earth might gain a little more length in its days, neither one asking for the trade, neither one able to stop it, only continuing patiently the way certain things simply continue because that is what they have always done. Psychologists often note that humans tend to measure their lives in units so much smaller than this. Hours, days, perhaps at most the span of a single lifetime. It can be strange and a little humbling to sit with a timescale this vast where a change too small to measure in 100 years is still somehow the same steady force that shaped the length of every day a person has ever lived without them ever knowing it was there. The brain tends to prefer patterns it can hold on to easily, rhythms short enough to notice, cycles small enough to remember. A day, a week, a single turning of the moon from full to dark and back again. It may be that this is part of why something on the scale of 400 million years feels less like a fact and more like a kind of quiet myth. Something almost impossible to hold in the mind for more than a moment before it slips gently back out of focus. And yet it is happening, right now, as quietly as everything else the moon does. The days are lengthening, the moon is drifting outward, and somewhere in that slow, patient exchange there is a kind of stillness worth resting inside for a while, rather than trying to fully understand. There is one more piece of this exchange that reaches further than the length of a single day. Something the moon has been holding steady this entire time, in a way that shapes not just how long each day feels, but how gently the seasons themselves are allowed to turn. Earth does not stand perfectly upright as it circles the sun. It leans gently at an angle of about 23.5 degrees, tilted slightly off to one side, the way a person might rest their head against a window on a long, quiet train ride. This tilt is the reason the seasons exist at all. Without it, there would be no long summer evenings, no early dark of winter, only a single unchanging kind of day repeating itself endlessly everywhere all year round. What we understand so far suggests that this tilt has remained remarkably steady for a very long time, wobbling only a little within a narrow, gentle range over the course of thousands of years. And it seems that a significant part of the reason for that steadiness is the Moon. Researchers have found that a planet's axial tilt left without a large nearby companion tends to drift. Not smoothly, not predictably, but in slow, uneven swings, shifting by many degrees over time, sometimes tipping a planet almost onto its side, sometimes pulling it nearly upright again in patterns too chaotic to fully predict. Mars, our smaller moonless neighbour, appears to experience exactly this kind of drift. Studies indicate that over long stretches of time, Mars's tilt has wandered considerably, swinging through wide, uneven ranges that would make its seasons, if it has anything resembling seasons at all, unpredictable in a way Earth's have never had to be. Earth, by comparison, has been fortunate enough to have a steady companion nearby, one large enough and close enough to gently anchor its lean. The Moon's gravity scientists suggest acts almost like a quiet hand resting against Earth's shoulder, not holding it perfectly still but keeping its natural wobble small and slow, and contained within a narrow, gentle range that has allowed the seasons to remain generation after generation more or less familiar. There is something worth resting on in that thought, that the reason autumn arrives softly and spring returns reliably, and summer holds itself in balance rather than swinging wildly into extremes, may have less to do with the sun and more to do with a quiet companion holding Earth steady from 240,000 miles away. It may be that without the Moon, Earth's tilt would have drifted far more dramatically over the ages, tipping toward extremes that would have made the climate far less forgiving. A planet leaning sharply on its side might bake beneath endless daylight on one pole, while the other remained locked in permanent darkness. Seasons no longer gentle transitions, but sudden, unbalanced shifts arriving without warning and staying for uncomfortably long stretches of time. Evidence suggests that such extreme tilts could have made the kind of steady, gradual seasonal rhythm we take for granted far harder to sustain. There is a quieter layer to this one that most people never consider. It is not simply that the Moon lights our nights or gently pulls at our oceans. It may have helped make Earth's climate itself more livable, even more forgiving across the long unfolding span of life's history here. Every mild autumn afternoon, every gradual softening of light in late spring, every ordinary unremarkable change of season arriving right on schedule may carry a small quiet debt to a companion most people rarely think to thank. Psychologists often note that humans respond deeply to predictability, drawing a sense of safety not from certainty about any single day, but from trust in a larger pattern. A season that always eventually turns. A winter that always eventually softens into something warmer. It seems that this trust, this quiet inherited faith in the turning of the year may rest on a foundation far more fragile and far more remarkable than most people ever pause to notice. A large nearby moon holding a tilt steady so that a pattern so many living things depend on could continue unbroken for millions upon millions of years. The brain tends to treat such deep, distant stability as background, something so constant that it barely registers as something at all. We do not wake each morning grateful that the tilt of the earth has not swung wildly overnight. We simply expect the season to be roughly what it was the day before, roughly what it will be again next year. It may be that this quiet, unnoticed trust is itself a kind of evidence not of certainty, but of just how steady this particular arrangement between Earth and its moon has managed to remain for longer than any single civilization has existed to notice. There is something gently humbling in imagining a version of Earth without that steadying presence, a world spinning a little more freely, a little more unpredictably, its seasons arriving in ways far less gentle than the ones we have quietly come to expect. Not a world without life necessarily. Life, it seems, tends to find a way to continue in one form or another under almost any condition, but perhaps a world with far less patience in it. Fewer long easy afternoons, fewer soft familiar transitions from one season into the next. It is worth letting that settle for a moment. All of this steadiness, this mildness, this quiet reliability in the turning of the year, resting not on the sun alone but on a small pale companion holding earth, just steady enough to let the seasons breathe gently one after another, for longer than any of us will ever be here to witness. There is still more waiting quietly beneath the surface of all this. Something the moon carries with it, older than the tilt it steadies, older even than the oceans. It pulls something that reaches all the way back to the very beginning of this planet's story. Long before there were oceans, long before there was any tilt to steady, long before there was anything resembling the quiet world we know now, Earth was a very different place. Younger, rougher, still forming, still cooling, still settling into the shape it would eventually hold. And it was during this early unfinished stage scientists suggest that something happened. Something enormous, something that would quietly determine the shape of nearly every night that followed. The most widely accepted explanation, the one most researchers have gathered around over decades of careful study, is something called the giant impact hypothesis. It suggests that somewhere in the ballpark of 4.5 billion years ago, a very early version of Earth collided with another world. A planet roughly the size of Mars, one that scientists have given the gentle, almost mythic name Theia. Not a scrape, not a graze, a full direct collision immense beyond easy imagining, one that would have reshaped both worlds entirely. It is a strange thing to picture lying here now in such a quiet room, that the same steady light drifting through your window tonight may trace its origin back to something so vast, so sudden, so far removed from anything gentle at all. What we understand so far suggests that this collision sent an enormous amount of material spinning outward into space debris from both worlds. Melted rock and dust and fragments too small to name caught in orbit around the young wounded Earth. Over time and by cosmic standards, this may have taken a surprisingly short while that debris began to gather, to draw together, to cool and compress and slowly take on a shape of its own. Evidence suggests that within perhaps only a few tens of millions of years, this scattered material had drawn itself into something whole, a single rounded body quietly settling into orbit around the planet that had in a sense given rise to it, the Moon. There is something almost tender in that origin story, if tender is the right word for something born of such violence. That out of a collision vast enough to reshape a planet, something steady emerged, something patient, something that would go on for billions of years afterward to soften our nights and hold our tilt and pull gently at our oceans twice a day, every day without fail. Researchers have found supporting evidence for this story in some unlikely places, including the moon rocks brought back by astronauts in the 20th century. Studies indicate that lunar rock carries a chemical signature remarkably similar to Earth's own mantle, closer than one might expect if the Moon had simply formed elsewhere and had later been captured by Earth's gravity, as some earlier theories once proposed. It seems that the Moon is not simply a companion Earth happened to acquire along the way. In a very real sense, it may be made partly of Earth itself, or of the same early material that helped shape Earth fuse together in that ancient violent moment, then separated again gently into two connected but distinct worlds. There is a kind of quiet kinship in that thought, that the pale light crossing the sky tonight is not a stranger's light borrowed briefly from somewhere else, but something closer to a very old relative formed from the same ancient material shaped by the same early fire, simply given its own separate path to follow afterward. The brain tends to find comfort in stories of shared origin. Psychologists often know even stories reaching back further than any single mind can properly hold. There is something steadying in imagining that the Moon and Earth are not simply two separate objects passing near each other in space, but two pieces of the same early event still quietly bound together, still moving through the universe side by side nearly 4.5 billion years later. It may be that this ancient collision also explains something else, something closer to home than distant chemistry. Scientists suggest that the same violent impact that formed the Moon may have also given early Earth its particular tilt, that same gentle lean of 23.5 degrees we spoke of earlier, the one that gives us seasons, the one the Moon has spent billions of years since quietly helping to hold steady. It is a strange, almost circular kind of grace. The collision that created the Moon may have also created the very tilt the Moon would later go on to protect. There are still quiet questions around exactly how this early period unfolded, the precise sequence of events, the exact size and angle of that ancient collision. Scientists are still exploring the finer details, refining the story a little more with each new piece of evidence, each new sample studied, each new simulation quietly run. But the broader shape of the story has held remarkably steady for decades now, a rare kind of stability in a field that often revises itself. There is something worth resting in gently at the centre of all this, that the Moon, so pale, so patient, so quietly present above nearly every night of human history, began its existence in something closer to chaos. Fire and collision and debris scattered wide across the early dark. And yet out of all of that violence something soft eventually formed, something round and steady and reflective, something that would spend the following billions of years doing nothing more dramatic than circling quietly and offering its borrowed light to anyone below who happened to look up. It is perhaps a gentle kind of lesson, though we will not linger on it too directly, that even the softest, most steadying presences in a life may have come from something far more turbulent long before they ever learned to be still. There is more to uncover in that ancient story, something written not in rock or chemistry this time, but in the very ground beneath your feet, in scars left behind by a sky that has not always been quite so quiet as it seems tonight. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to the Moon's surface, the deep, older sort of quiet that comes from having no wind, no rain, nothing at all to soften what happens there. When something strikes it, whatever mark that impact leaves behind stays exactly as it was, undisturbed sometimes, for billions of years. It seems that the Moon does not forget. Not the way Earth does, where wind and water and slow patient erosion quietly smooth over almost everything eventually. What we understand so far suggests that this quality gives the Moon something remarkable, a kind of open visible record of nearly everything that has passed through this part of space since not long after it first formed. Each crater marks a moment, a single arrival, a small piece of rock or ice, sometimes barely larger than a stone you might hold in one hand, sometimes vast enough to reshape an entire region, arriving out of the dark and leaving its signature behind permanently in a surface with nothing to wear it away. There is something quietly moving in that idea that the Moon has spent billions of years simply keeping watch, holding, still letting each small arrival write itself into its skin one mark after another, layered patiently across an entire visible history. Researchers have found that many of these ancient impacts were not unique to the Moon alone. Earth sharing the same general region of space, moving through the same scattered debris left over from the solar system's early chaotic formation, would have been struck just as often, likely more often, given its larger size and stronger gravitational pull. The difference lies only in what happened afterward. Earth scars worn down by rain and rivers and the slow grinding movement of its shifting surface have mostly faded, folded quietly back into the landscape over time. The Moon's scars simply remained untouched, a kind of shared history written twice, but preserved in only one place. It may be that this is part of why the moon has always felt to so many people gazing up at it like something closer to memory than to light. A quiet witness holding a story that Earth itself has long since forgotten how to tell. There is another layer to this old cratered surface, one that reaches beyond simple record keeping into something closer to quiet protection. Scientists suggest that in this shared region of space, the moon's presence may occasionally intercept material that might otherwise have continued on uninterrupted toward Earth. Not in any dramatic, deliberate way. Simply by existing nearby the moon adds one more surface, one more small chance for a wandering fragment of rock to end its long journey somewhere other than our own atmosphere. Evidence suggests this protective effect is far more modest than popular imagination sometimes assumes, a gentle influence rather than a dramatic shield. The moon is small and space is vast, and most of what drifts through it passes by both worlds without ever coming close to either. But over the full span of billions of years across countless slow patient orbits, even a small occasional difference can add up to something worth quietly acknowledging. A companion standing a little apart from us, absorbing a small share of what the wider universe occasionally sends this way. There is something gently reassuring in that thought, even knowing how modest the effect truly is. That the moon's scarred, silent surface carries not only a record of the past, but perhaps here and there a small trace of quiet service as well, marks left behind by material that never reached us because it found the moon instead. The mind quietly registers old weathered things differently than it registers something new. Psychologists often note that a sense of history of visible age tends to invite a particular kind of respect, almost reverence, the same way an old worn stone building might feel different to stand inside than something built only last year. The moon's craters seen through even a modest telescope carry that same weight, not smooth, not polished, openly visibly old in a way that very little on Earth's own surface is ever allowed to remain. Some of the largest of these craters, vast basins hundreds of miles across, formed during a particularly intense stretch of impacts scientists refer to gently as the Late Heavy Bombardment, a period early in the solar system's history when debris from its formation was still settling, still finding its way toward whatever larger bodies happened to be nearby. Studies indicate that Earth would have experienced this same intense period, this same chaotic scattering of impacts, though almost none of that direct evidence remains here, worn away long ago by everything that came after. It is the moon, then, that holds this particular chapter of the story quietly on our behalf, a shared history that only one of the two worlds still remembers to tell. There is something worth sitting with in that arrangement, that Earth softened and renewed again and again by wind and rain, and time has been allowed to forget its most violent early years, while the moon, still and untouched, has simply continued holding, the memory steady, unclaimed, waiting patiently above us for anyone curious enough to look up and wonder what those pale circular marks might actually mean. There is a stillness in that kind of keeping, a very old, very patient kind of stillness, one that reaches even further than the marks left on the moon's own surface. Something the mind, it seems, has been keeping still and patient all along, in a much quieter place than the sky. There is a small structure resting deep inside the human brain, no larger than a grain of rice, tucked quietly behind the eyes, that has spent your entire life paying close attention to light. It is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and neuroscientists have observed that this tiny cluster of cells acts as something close to a master clock, quietly coordinating when the body feels alert and when it feels ready to rest, based largely on the light it senses entering through the eyes even when the eyes themselves are closed. For nearly all of human history, before electric light existed, before rooms could be lit at will, long after sunset, this internal clock would have known only two real sources of light after dusk: firelight flickering and warm close to the ground, and moonlight distant pale spilling gently over the landscape on the nights it was strong enough to reach through the dark. It seems that this second source, this old borrowed silvery light, may have played a small quiet role in shaping how the human body has come to understand the night. Studies indicate that in the days leading up to a full moon, when moonlight is at its brightest, some research has found subtle shifts in human sleep patterns, a few minutes less total. Sleep on average, a slightly longer stretch before falling asleep in the first place. The effect when it appears at all tends to be small, gentle, more of a whisper than a clear signal. Scientists are still exploring exactly how consistent this pattern is, and whether it holds true across different environments, different cultures, different lives lived under very different amounts of artificial light. But it is a soft thing to imagine nonetheless, that some faint, ancient part of the body may still be listening for the moon even now, even in a room with curtains drawn and the lights already off. There is something almost moving in that possibility, that long after most of us have stopped consciously noticing the moon's phase from one night to the next, some quiet corner of the body may still be quietly keeping track the way an old habit lingers long after the reason for it has been forgotten. The mind quietly registers light in ways that reach far beyond simple vision. Researchers have found that even very dim light, far too faint to read by, can still influence the body's internal sense of time, nudging certain hormones, certain rhythms in one direction or another, gently, gradually, without ever announcing itself directly. Moonlight at its brightest is still hundreds of thousands of times dimmer than daylight, and yet it seems to be just bright enough, just present enough to leave the faintest trace on some of these very old, very sensitive systems. It may be that this helps explain part of why moonlight has always felt different from other kinds of artificial light, softer, somehow less demanding, less likely to fully wake the mind the way a bright lamp or a glowing screen tends to. Evidence suggests that certain wavelengths of light, particularly the cooler, bluer tones found in most electric lighting, interfere more strongly with the body's natural sense of night than the warmer, gentler light the moon happens to reflect. In that sense, moonlight may be one of the few remaining lights left that the body still fully recognizes as safe to rest beneath. There is a particular kind of trust the body seems to place in that recognition. Psychologists often note that a sense of safety at night is built from countless small familiar signals gathered slowly over an entire lifetime and inherited in part from every life that came before it as well. A certain quality of light, a certain quiet outside the window, a certain stillness in the room that says gently without words that it is now safe to let go. It may be that moonlight has been part of that quiet signal for longer than any single person could ever remember, directly passed down instead through something deeper than memory, something closer to instinct folded into the body over many, many generations of ancestors who slept beneath skies with no other light at all, besides the moon and the stars and the occasional flicker of a distant fire. The mind, it seems, has been keeping something still and patient all along. Not a memory exactly, nothing so specific or so easily named, but something close to it. A quiet, inherited familiarity with a particular kind of light, one that asks nothing, demands nothing, simply arrives softly the way it always has and waits patiently to be recognized. There is something worth resting inside right here in this thought, that some part of you right now lying in the dark may still be quietly listening for that same old light, the way it has listened for countless nights before this one, long before you ever learned to notice it consciously at all. And beneath that quiet recognition there is something else waiting, something that reaches beyond the body entirely, into the way whole groups of creatures move through the dark guided by a light most of them never chose and have never once questioned. There is a particular night every year on certain beaches in Florida and Costa Rica and parts of the Mediterranean coast when something quiet and ancient happens almost entirely out of sight. Sea turtles, having spent years, sometimes decades, wandering the open ocean, return to the very beach where they themselves once hatched to dig a nest and lay their eggs and disappear back into the water before morning arrives. What we understand so far suggests that the newly hatched turtles, once they emerge from the sand weeks later, rely on a very particular kind of guidance to find their way to the water. Researchers have found that hatchlings tend to move instinctively toward the brightest, most open part of the horizon, a behaviour that for most of evolutionary history reliably pointed them toward the sea, where moonlight and starlight reflecting off open water created a clear natural glow brighter than the darker silhouette of dunes and vegetation further inland. It is a small, quiet kind of trust, isn't it? A newly hatched creature only minutes old with no memory, no guidance from any parent, simply following the light because the light has always led the way before. Scientists suggest that this same reliance on natural light patterns extends far beyond sea turtles alone. Certain species of moths appear to use the moon as a fixed point of reference while flying, maintaining a steady angle relative to its position in the sky, a navigational trick that works beautifully under an open moonlit night when the moon sits so far away that its angle barely shifts no matter how far the moth travels. Evidence suggests that some migratory birds may draw on a similar principle, using the moon along with the stars as one part of a much larger internal compass built from magnetic fields and star patterns and the position of celestial light overhead. There is something quietly moving in imagining all of this happening simultaneously all over the world on any ordinary clear night. Turtles moving towards the water, moths adjusting their flight against a distant steady light, birds threading their way across entire continents, guided in part by cues too subtle for a human eye to easily notice unless someone happens to be looking very closely and very patiently for a very long time. Studies indicate that when this natural light pattern is disrupted by nearby artificial lighting, along a coastline for instance, the consequences can be surprisingly significant. Sea turtle hatchlings drawn instead toward the brighter glow of streetlights or building sometimes move inland rather than toward the water, following the same ancient instinct, only now misled by a kind of light nature never prepared them for. It seems that instincts built carefully over millions of years can be disrupted quite easily, quite unintentionally, simply by the presence of a light source their ancestors never had reason to account for. There is a gentle kind of lesson in that, though we will let it pass by softly, without dwelling on it too long. That some of the oldest, most reliable patterns in nature depend on conditions holding steady night after night in ways easy to take for granted, until something changes. The moon itself asks nothing of these creatures. It offers no signal on purpose, sends no message meant specifically for a hatchling turtle or a night-flying moth. It simply exists, steady and patient, reflecting whatever light happens to reach it. And countless different forms of life across millions of years have simply learned to read that steady presence as something worth trusting. Psychologists often note that trust in general tends to form not through grand gestures but through quiet, unbroken consistency repeated so many times that it eventually stops feeling like trust at all and starts to feel like something closer to certainty. It may be that this is exactly what has happened between the natural world and the moon, an old wordless kind of certainty built patiently across generations of turtles and moths and birds, none of which ever needed to understand why the moon behaved the way it did, only that it always had and so far always continued to. There is something worth resting in imagining all these small separate lives scattered across oceans and continents, quietly bound together by the same pale light overhead. A newly hatched turtle finding the sea, a moth holding its course through open air, a bird crossing an entire hemisphere guided in part by something so far away it barely seems real and yet has never once failed to be there. The brain tends to find comfort in stories where very different things turn out to be quietly connected. Psychologists often note small separate patterns revealing themselves eventually to be part of something larger. There is a version of that comfort available here too, in imagining the moon not as a single distant object but as something closer to a quiet thread running gently through countless different lives, holding them in small invisible ways a little closer to where they need to be. It is worth letting that image rest for a while. All of this trust, all of this quiet reliance resting on something that has simply continued to show up faithfully every single night for longer than any of these creatures or their ancestors before them have ever been alive to notice. There is still one more kind of connection left to consider, one that reaches beyond instinct and navigation into something closer to meaning itself. The way people across so many different times and places have looked up at this same quiet light and found in it something worth remembering. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a person standing beneath a full moon, one that seems to cross almost every culture, every era, every corner of the inhabited world. Researchers have found that some of the oldest surviving art made by human hands includes markings believed to track the moon's changing phases, carved into bone painted onto cave walls, arranged carefully into circles of stone, long before anyone had a word for astronomy or a reason to think of the sky as something separate from everyday life. It seems that people have always looked up. Not only out of curiosity, though, curiosity was certainly part of it, but out of something closer to companionship. Studies indicate that across many early societies from parts of ancient Mesopotamia to early agricultural communities in East Asia and the Americas, the moon's steady cycle became one of the very first ways humans learned to measure time itself, long before the sun's yearly path was fully understood, long before anything resembling a modern calendar existed. There is something quietly moving in that before people counted years before they divided time into months in the way we do now. And even now the word month still carries the moon's own name folded gently inside it. They simply watch the moon faithfully and let its rhythm become their own. Evidence suggests that this reliance ran deeper than simple timekeeping. In many early farming communities, planting and harvesting were guided in part by lunar phases, a practice that persisted in various quiet forms well into more recent history. Fishing communities along coastlines in Portugal and Japan in the Pacific Islands learned to read the moon's phase as a signal for the tides, understanding instinctively long before anyone could explain gravity that a full or new moon meant especially high or especially low water, and planned their work accordingly. It may be that this long practical relationship with the moon eventually softened into something less functional and more emotional. Psychologists often note that humans tend to form attachments not only to people but to steady recurring presences in the environment around them, patterns that offer a quiet sense of continuity across an otherwise unpredictable life. The moon appearing faithfully night after night, phase after phase, century after century, may have become for many cultures one of the most reliable presences a person could ever hope to witness. There is a tenderness in the way different cultures have chosen to speak about the moon across history. In parts of ancient Greece, it was closely tied to notions of measured time and quiet femininity. In many East Asian traditions, the full moon in autumn became and often still remains an occasion for families to gather to share food together, and to sit quietly beneath the same light their ancestors once sat beneath, generation folding gently into generation. In several indigenous cultures across North America, particular full moons were given names tied closely to the season, a way of weaving the sky itself into the practical rhythm of daily life, planting, harvesting, gathering, resting. It seems that wherever people have lived, whatever language they have spoken, whatever else has divided one community from another, the moon has remained something close to shared ground. A single quiet light visible from nearly anywhere on Earth, offering the same soft glow to a fishing village in Norway as it does to a quiet rooftop in Lisbon or a warmly lit window somewhere in the American countryside. The brain tends to find particular comfort in things experienced collectively, even across distance, even without direct contact. Neuroscientists have observed that a sense of connection does not always require physical closeness, only a shared reference point, something both people can look toward and recognize together. It may be that the moon has quietly served this purpose for longer than almost anything else in human experience, a single point of light that has never once needed translation. There is something gently moving in imagining all of this at once right now, tonight. Somewhere someone else is also looking up at this same moon in a different time zone, a different language, a different life entirely, and yet sharing in that single quiet moment the exact same pale light you might be resting beneath as well. What we understand so far suggests that this sense of shared witness, this feeling of being quietly connected to people we will never meet, simply by looking at the same sky, may be one of the gentlest, most enduring gifts the moon has offered. Humanity, long before anyone understood tides or gravity, or the ancient collision that formed it in the first place. Long before any of the science we have spoken of tonight had a name at all, people already knew somehow that there was comfort in this particular light. There is a soft kind of grace in that. That something so distant, so silent, asking nothing of anyone, has still managed to become one of the quiet threads holding so much of human history gently together one ordinary night at a time. And now, as the night settles a little further still, there is only a little further left to drift. A last quiet stretch of sky and stillness waiting patiently just ahead. There is a particular kind of light that only appears when the moon is at its thinnest, a pale ghostly glow resting quietly across the darkened part of its surface, faint enough that most people walk past it without ever noticing it is there. Astronomers gave it a gentle name a long time ago, Earthshine, and it comes from something almost tender to imagine sunlight bouncing off our own planet, travelling all the way to the moon and reflecting softly back to us again, a kind of light that has touched 3 different worlds before it ever reaches an eye. Researchers have found that this glow is strongest during a crescent moon, when only a thin sliver is lit distractedly by the sun, and the rest of its surface waits in shadow, faintly illuminated instead by Earth's own reflected daylight. It seems that Earth from the moon's perspective would appear far brighter than the moon ever appears to us, a wide pale blue presence hanging in a black sky, large enough to cast its own gentle light across a neighbouring world. There is something quietly moving in that thought, that even in its darkest, thinnest phase, the moon is never entirely without light. It borrows twice, once from the sun directly, and once again faintly from us, a soft second-hand glow, drifting quietly across whatever part of its face happens to be turned away from the day. What we understand so far suggests that early astronomers were puzzled by this pale glow for a long time, unsure why the dark part of a crescent moon should carry any light at all. It took centuries of careful observation before the explanation settled into place gently, the way most patient discoveries eventually do. Not magic, not mystery. Simply light reflected and reflected again, travelling quietly between 2 worlds that have never stopped watching each other. On the nights when the moon disappears from the sky entirely during what is called a new moon, something else becomes possible instead. Evidence suggests that these are the nights when the stars themselves appear at their clearest unchallenged by any nearby glow, free to fill the whole dark expanse without competition. Scientists suggest that this darker sky reveals detail otherwise lost on brighter nights, faint clusters, distant galaxies, soft trails of light from stars so far away that what reaches us now left its source before recorded history began. It is a strange kind of trade, isn't it? On nights without the moon, we lose its gentle, familiar glow, but gain in exchange a fuller view of everything that lies beyond it. Nothing is simply absent. Something else always quietly steps forward to fill the space. Studies indicate that this rhythm, bright nights and dark nights trading places roughly every 2 weeks, has shaped more than just how clearly we can see the stars. Certain nocturnal animals adjust their behavior accordingly, some more active and more visible under a full moon's light, others preferring the deeper cover of moonless night to move more safely unseen. It seems that darkness itself is not one single thing, but a whole quiet spectrum, shifting gradually from one shade to another, and countless lives have learned over long stretches of time to move gently along with it. There is a kind of grace in imagining the whole system together. Now, all the pieces we have gathered slowly across this long quiet night. The tides rising and falling, the tilt held steady, the ancient light borrowed and returned, the old cratered memory of a violent beginning softened now into something calm. All of it circling patiently in a rhythm so old that nothing alive today was present to see it begin, and so steady that very little alive today will be present to see it end. Very far in the future, scientists suggest this rhythm will continue to change slowly the way it always has. The moon will keep drifting outward by the smallest measurable amount each year, and Earth's days will keep lengthening so gradually that even 100 more generations would scarcely notice the difference. It may be that billions of years from now, the sky will look a little different than it does tonight. The moon, a little smaller in appearance, a little more distant, its pull a little gentler than it has ever been in human memory. None of that needs to concern us now. It is simply a soft, quiet fact, resting somewhere far ahead, the kind of thing that exists more as a feeling than as a worry. A reminder, gentle rather than heavy, that even the most permanent seeming things in the sky are only permanent across the very short span of a single lifetime. Across anything longer, everything drifts slowly, patiently, the way this entire story has drifted tonight. For now, none of that distant future matters. What matters is only this, tonight, this particular sky, however you happen to find it. Clear or clouded, bright with moonlight or dark and quiet with stars instead. Let it rest there now. The tides, the tilt, the old collision, the coral and the turtles and the small creatures that learned to read a light none of them ever chose. All of it settling now softly the way everything settles eventually, given enough quiet and enough time. There is nowhere left to go from here, only further down into stillness. The moon is still there, somewhere above the roof, above the clouds, moving the way it has always moved. Slowly, without hurry. It does not need your attention to continue existing. It never has. It simply drifts pale and patient the way it has for longer than any single mind could hold. Somewhere right now the tide is turning very softly along some far unseen shore. Somewhere a small quiet creature is settling into a rhythm it has always known without ever needing to understand why. Somewhere someone else in some other room in some other part of the world is lying still the way you are lying still now beneath this very same light. None of it needs to be remembered. Not the tides, not the tilt, not the ancient patient scars. Let it all soften now the way thoughts do, right at the edge of sleep, losing their shape a little more with each breath. The room is quiet. The dark is easy. Nothing more needs to happen tonight. The moon will still be there tomorrow whether it is remembered or not. It always has been. It will go on being there patient and pale for longer than anyone could ever need to think about. For now there is only this, the dark, the stillness, the soft familiar weight of everything around you, the slow easing rhythm of breath in and out, the way the tide comes in and goes out and comes in again. Let it go now. Just rest. Somewhere above, quietly faithfully, the light is still there, and so are you, just here, Just this, nothing more.